Good morning, everybody. Are we ready to start? Video guy? We good? Okay, my name is Barry Kouns. I'm with Risk-Based Security. My son, Jacob, has kind of been in front of the group a little bit. He kind of runs and organizes and originally founded RVAsec. So every other year or so, he'll let me submit a presentation, and I get selected. And so here I am for the second time. And my topic this morning is incident response management. And you'll notice the phone on fire up there. I was looking for a guy on fire, you know, running around with his hair on fire, but I thought maybe I shouldn't have that graphic, so I just stuck with a phone on fire, because that's not what we want to do when it comes to incident management. So just want to walk you through very briefly a quick overview of what I want to cover today. I have a couple slides on basically a disclaimer, meaning what the topic is and what the topic isn't. Because all of you probably have a different view of what is an incident and what does the management of that incident mean. I want to kind of focus us a little bit. We'll do a poll. In the previous years, I tried to do a little quiz, you know, to see if we, true-false quiz, and we'll have a little poll, true-false. Then I'm going to look at, do we really need incident management? Why? Who cares? The language, definitions. Spend more time on that so that we can get on the same page. And then we're going to talk about how risk of harm plays into that topic. Reporting and response framework, and then we'll wrap it up with some best practices. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at doing. I have 50 minutes, and I want this to be as interactive and sharing as we possibly can be. If you have a question or a comment or a correction, please do so right at the time. I only put you off if I'm going to cover it in a slide, in a minute or two. But please interact with me, argue with me. Okay. I argued with this guy last night at the beer hop, so we're going to do well. So good. That's what I want. Please talk to me. Okay. So a disclaimer. I'm not going to be talking about business disruptions, okay, which, as we all know, is part of security, CIA, or IDS, IPS alerts, data corruption, scans, attempted access, all this kind of stuff, log analysis, malicious code. Got experts in here about that. Natural disasters, help desk tickets, these kind of attacks. And I know there's a lot of activity that goes on there. But what I want to focus this talk on is potential exposure of PII, PHI, okay? It really boils down to when do I have to notify the, quote, victims, and the thought process getting to that, okay? That's what I'm after here. So basically, I'm not, CIA is a part of security. I'm kind of focusing in on the confidentiality side, not all of the automatically generated, quote, incidents. For instance, I pulled this out of a PwC report, 42.8 million incidents. And I'm going, wow, what is the definition of an incident that they're using? Because we collect, RBS collects data breach information, and we only collected about 3,000 data breaches. Sometimes we call them incidents. They got 42.8 million. They have a different definition than we do. This is not the topic. 42.8 million, that is not where we're going to talk about today. Okay, let's get ready for a poll. Anybody know who this guy is? What movie? What's his name? I think it's Commodus, right? Wasn't it Commodus? Something like that? Okay, so thumbs up or thumbs down? Having a documented incident response is optional for most organizations. All right. Well, Commodus says, no, it isn't really optional. You need to have one. In fact, it's like having a will. Even if you don't have one, you got one. It may be run by the state or federal government, but you have one. How about this one? Incident management process is a support aid, not a decision-making tool. Huh? Come on, participate, help me. Okay, Commodus agrees with you. Okay, now you got the idea. Here we go. So, establishing a team before an incident will have a positive influence on how they're handled. All right, exactly. Most security experts says it's not a matter of if your organization will be breached, but when. Do we really believe this, right? In fact, I see Diane in the audience. I think I took this one from her. How about this? There are two kinds of organizations, those that have been breached and know it, and those that don't know it.
Actually, there's three.
There's three?
There's the ones that are breached and don't care.
Yeah, and I think there may be the four. There's ones that are breached, they know it, but they don't report it. Or they look for reasons not to report it, as we had a conversation last night. All right, here we go. Speed of response is all that really matters. Yeah, definitely. Data breaches, isn't that why we buy cyber insurance in the first place? How many of us work at organizations that have cyber insurance policies? Okay, okay, so there's a little bit. I will recommend that if you don't and you haven't looked into it, you should suggest looking into it. Really. It's not as expensive as you might think, and the coverages are reasonably good. And if you have any questions about that, you can see my colleague Inga up here in the front row. She's an expert on all that stuff. Seriously. And by the way, RBS does not sell cyber insurance. Okay, a couple more. Oops, I gave you the answer to that one. Prevention seems to be a losing battle. Maybe we should focus our money on detecting, response, and recovery. I got up and down in the same row. What do you think? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here, but if we believe that a breach is inevitable, and some of us don't even know we've been breached, maybe it makes sense. Anyway, I think yes. Preparing for something that never happened is a complete waste of money. Of course. All right. Incident management can impact the level of risk to your business, your brand, your reputation. Any of you work for Target or Home Depot or Heartland, right? This will kill you. The goal of incident response is to handle the situation in a way that limits and reduces recovery time and costs. How can that be false, right? That's got to be. It sounds too official. Standard definitions of data breach terms have been applied across all industries. Right. I mean, when people were talking and they say, oh, we've had an incident. What is your definition of incident? And that is a major part of my talk with today, is to try to offer up to you some definitions that are management friendly. Okay, almost last. The nature and severity of unauthorized access to data should determine the response. The nature and severity of access to data could determine our response. I don't see a lot of people. I think yes. We'll see if you agree with me at the end. An organization can be too quick to notify. Hurry up. It's all about speed. No. Wait a minute. Yes. They can be too quick. That's what I mean. Okay. We're on the same page. We kind of warmed up. Any comments, questions? Any polling anybody else like to do? Okay. But do I really need to be concerned with incident management? If you haven't already been convinced, we're going to look at some numbers here. As I mentioned, risk-based security collects a lot of this stuff. And over the years, we've been collecting publicly reported data breaches. and all the information that we can gather from these public reports, and look at the number of records, individual records that have been exposed. We're talking about over 1 billion just last year. The total number now is in excess of 3 billion, a lot, and the curve's not going in the right direction. You add that number of incidents, and you can see it's also rising significantly. And so far this year, we have over 1,000 incidents that we've collected, and 191 million records have been exposed. So this isn't going away, which just further supports everything we agreed to earlier, that it's only a matter of time before we get breached. Let's talk about software vulnerabilities. That's another thing we collect. And look at these numbers. 2006, 11,000, it kind of went down a little, and look at the steady increase since 2011. Over 13,000 new vulnerabilities exposed, reported, however you want to talk about it. We're currently tracking well over 121,000 vulnerabilities. And by the way, for those of you who rely on NVD, CVE, that number equals about 36,000 more vulnerabilities than they have given a CVE number to. So there's a big population of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities means exploits, means opportunity for you to get breached, right? So there's a lot of activity that's pushing at us. And of course, there's all kinds of regulations that require you to have incident response, breach response, notification alerts, things like that. Regulator activity, and I don't mean for you to have to read all this, but I just wanted to share with you that Health and Human Services grew their scope, largest fine ever in 2014. Many cyber regulators are focusing on how prepared you are and how you respond more so than what you did to prevent. Cyber insurance as an indicator of an organization's maturity. So they're looking at it, hey, yes, you do all these things, but in order to protect the business, have some insurance. Some more. 50th data breach settlement in 2014 from the FTC. Of course, California is always leading us in fines and regulations and things like that. Continues to do so. FTC, $10 million fine last year to regional telecoms. FIEC launched a pilot program looking at 500 banks and credit unions. So the question is, are you kind of convinced yet that a data breach is looming and maybe incident response is something we need to do? I love this.
You're going to need a bigger boat.
Remember that? So the bottom line is, if we don't have an incident response program, we're in a very small boat and a big fish is looking at us. Okay, that makes sense. So far, are you with me? Okay, I don't see anybody leaving, so we're in good shape. Okay. All right, now, let's get into some definitions, because I can't talk to you about some recommendations until we're on the same page on how we define this stuff. Okay, incident response itself has a couple quick definitions I'm sure you would agree with. The activities that address short-term direct effects of an incident may also support short-term recovery. Okay. Capability to manage these things. The coordination of activities. I mean, it all makes sense. So we're trying to get organized to address things that have been disruptive. Now, here's where I want to lead you. I want to lead you into distinguishing 4 levels of a, quote, security event, issue, incident, what do you want to call it. So I'm going to walk you through a definition of event, vulnerability, incident, and breach, okay? With the risk escalating and all the things going with it. And I want you to kind of create a mindset for you. So let's start looking at some of these definitions of event. Is identified occurrence of a system, service, network indicating a possible breach. results in unauthorized disclosure, according to the NCA, ITIL, any occurrence which is not part of standard operation. Okay, that all makes sense. An event could also be, out of the ISO standard. It can be more than one occasion, occurrence rather. Something not happening, could be referred to as an incident or an accident. And then it can also be referred to, that's a near miss of this. If we start talking like this to management, and they are not on the same page with us as to what we mean, then we're not going to be able to communicate and not do this job effectively. Okay? So lots of different definitions for event. Vulnerability. Okay? I think we all have a pretty good idea what vulnerability means, right? It's an existence of a weakness wherever that an undesirable event might take advantage of it, right? Remember, you have threats, but without being vulnerable to it, that threat cannot take place. So I think we're on a pretty good footing about that. A weakness which allows an attacker, right? Intersection of three things: susceptibility, access, and incapability to exploit. All these are good, solid definitions. A flaw or weakness in a system. So it boils down to, on vulnerability, something has been exposed or is exposed, but not necessarily taken advantage of. Does that make sense? Okay, be with me on that. Okay, and there's the last one. Now, here's a couple definitions of the word incident. It's an attempted or successful unauthorized access, use, etc. And so it's both attempted and successful. But is there not a difference between attempted and unsuccessful and successful? I think you'll start seeing where I'm heading here to separate the various terms. Situation that might or could lead to various things. Incident is a single or series of unwanted expectations, thought of as a violation. Okay, then it's kind of a mishmash of different definitions in there. An event which causes an interruption. Okay, all of these very solid references have different variations on it. Now let's talk about a breach. What's the definition of breach? Unauthorized movement that is not authorized to see the information. If I see the information, does that make it a breach? Maybe. A breach of security, this comes out of the Massachusetts 201 CMR 17. Those of you probably familiar with this, a very prescriptive requirement here. They go through quite a bit. Creates a substantial risk of identity theft or fraud. Okay. Now they're starting to talk a language that I think we can deal with. And then, of course, the Florida statute kind of zeroes in on just computerized data. So there's all kinds of different definitions. All right, now, here's where I want you to see if you agree with what I call management-friendly definitions of those four terms, okay? So we'll start with event. Notice the green color. It's an occurrence that has not yet been classified, meaning we haven't analyzed it. We don't know. Somebody said, hey, I think maybe something happened. We don't know. So it's an event because it hasn't been classified as one of the other things, okay? A vulnerability is an event upon analysis did not result in the exposure of PHI, but a weakness was discovered that could have compromised the information. Okay, so that's a vulnerability that has not been exploited. Incident. It's a vulnerability that after analysis did result in reasonable probability of exposing the data, meaning somebody saw it who shouldn't have seen it, or they have access to it. But the risk of harm to an individual has not occurred, and in our judgment, is not likely to occur. Are you with me? I'll give you an example of that in a little bit, because there is a difference. Not all unauthorized data exposure results in an honest assessment that harm is going to occur to the people whose data was exposed. Can you think of a opportunity like that? Okay, think, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. Now, a breach, on the other hand, it is an incident that has resulted in the probability that it's been subject to unauthorized access. So someone who shouldn't have seen it or had access to it has done so. And the misuse of that information has occurred, or the risk of harm to individuals is probable. You with me? You see the difference? And so these are the definitions that helps managers kind of understand. And of course, what this really boils down to, we just walked up this curve, right? We walked up this curve. So as I move up the curve to breach, bigger and worse things happen. More notification has to take place, et cetera. More managers need to be involved, et cetera, et cetera. The risk of harm to individuals is growing. And along with that risk of harm is escalation of notification, right? Up to and including authorities and regulators and the people, et cetera. This makes sense so far? Okay, so now let's talk about whether or not, I want to get your opinion on whether or not risk of harm should play a role in determining whether or not we have an incident that we don't have to tell anybody outside our organization about, or a breach, which we do have to tell and report to individuals. You know, the letters. Has everyone here received one of those notification letters? I'd be really surprised if you hadn't. In fact, in a little bit, we're going to walk through one very recently to see if you get the same feeling out of it that I did. All right, well, 40 of the 47 states, now there are 47 states who have data breach notification laws. There's still 3 states that do not have laws. Anybody know who they are? Nope. Starts with an A, though. Alabama, South Dakota, and New Mexico. All the other states have some sort of data breach notification laws. But in 40 of those 47 states, and here's West Virginia, puts right in there, notification is required only if the entity reasonably believes the breach has caused or will cause identity theft. So, as an organization has been breached, I make a judgment of whether or not the data that has been exposed that's yours, whether there's a chance of anybody using it in a bad way to harm you, I don't have to report. Okay? 40 or 47 states have a similar opportunity for the breached organization to make a judgment. So what does that tell you? I mentioned that we collect reported data breaches. There's a lot of data breaches going on that through either proper judgment or convenient judgment are not being reported. So it's a tip of the iceberg. Okay, Wisconsin is not required if it does not create a material risk, okay? A breach has caused or will cause. That's our own Commonwealth here in Virginia. Arkansas, no reasonable likelihood of harm. So it's not required. So it gives us an out. So you need to know that when you get a letter, most of these companies, regardless of what it says within the letter, there is a more than reasonable chance that you could be harmed. Okay, take them seriously. And the last one, Utah, has occurred or even like it there. So you get my point here. So this risk of harm is an important element that you should have and address within your incident management. Okay, now I'm not suggesting you take liberties with it. I'm saying you do an honest assessment, one that would stand up in court, is my view. Okay, so here are a quick view of the 40 states in red that have this harm, and I just slapped in those 3 yellow ones real quick to say that these guys haven't even published a law requiring anything at this point. Okay. Let's see. Oh, the ones that are in white, they do not have a risk of harm. So if your breach involves a resident of California, it's not giving you the liberty to make that judgment. So if there's a breach involving California resident, you must report it. That's what it's saying. It doesn't give you that risk of harm out. Thank you for the question. Okay, and even the Health and Human Services agrees in terms of, with the HIPAA. There needs to be that risk of harm. Now, in the HIPAA documents, looking at this area here, they're trying to guide you in what would be a reasonable, objective judgment, okay? So identify the nature and extent of the PHI involved, okay? It's not all equal. Who was actually the unauthorized person that got to solve the information, got to see the information? Whether or not it was actually acquired or viewed, and the extent of which it has been mitigated. So they're kind of guiding you with these minimal things you ought to consider before you make the judgment that there's no likely harm. Does that make sense? So you just can't make a convenient thing. You have to have some backup. And I think that's for your own protection as an incident response team. Okay? Okay, so I'll stop there for just a second. Does this make sense? Or I'm trying to communicate a thought process that allows an organization to legitimately assess whether or not the exposure that took place will harm someone, and then based on that decision, escalate the notification. Okay, because that's costly in a lot of ways. Okay, does this make sense? Okay, thumbs up? Okay, thank you. All right, now, I want to walk you through the thought process a little bit more. Okay, so we start out with a security event report or an email or however, remember that iceberg thing I was showing you? When we cross above to, hey, there might be an exposure of PHI or PII. That gets reported into whomever, whoever's responsible for this. In fact, we had a conversation last night like, do you know who you should report such an event to? How many of you know that if you were in your work area and you saw something that looked suspicious in terms of a security event, how many of you know exactly who and how to report it? Okay, that's not bad. It kind of looks like maybe a little less than half. Okay, now whether or not that's just that you don't know or that there is nothing defined, we don't know. Okay, good. So anyway, a security event happens. It gets to somebody who's trying now to determine whether there's been any exposure, right? And the decision, if it turns out to be a false alarm or they didn't know what they were talking about or whatever the case may be, then it just stays an event. It gets logged, it gets tracked, et cetera, but it's just an event. And that's all we do. We stop, we log it in, we do any corrective action, maybe it's retraining the person or whatever. However, if there's potential exposure, now it becomes a vulnerability, right? Based on our definitions, I'm not sure yet, but something isn't quite right. We've got to do some more analysis. Now, I'm going to go through this like, oh, we just did analysis. But many of you know that analysis could be painful, detailed, requiring forensic experts. I'm not trying to downplay that, but we need to understand whether there really was exposure. So let's say potentially, yes, there was. Now we have to see whether there was actual exposure. Was it? You see where I'm going with this, right? I'm trying to determine whether or not it was just a vulnerability. An example, I was working with a financial institution, and it was reported that when one of our clients logged on to a particular application, not only could they see their information, they could also see someone else's information, account information, et cetera. That's a vulnerability. Through some forensics, we've determined that although that was a vulnerability, there was no evidence in the logs or anywhere else that anyone actually did that. You with me? So we stopped that this was a vulnerability. It needed to be fixed. but there's no evidence that anyone who shouldn't have seen information actually did. That's just one small example of this. However, at the same time, we could have concluded, yep, so-and-so and so-and-so, or various institutions, they saw something they shouldn't have seen, okay? Now we have an incident. You with me? Or a vulnerability. Now I have a real-life incident that is going to require a risk of harm analysis, right? Let's see, are we worried about this? If the answer is no, then we log, stop, do some corrective action, we're done. Let's stick with that same financial institution analogy. What we found out, let's say in this case, was that this credit union was able to see that credit union's account information. The point being, that credit union, the risk of harm of that particular person who has all the rights associated with that credit union just happened to see one of our members' information. The risk of that credit union actually harming our member or customer was so small that it's not a breach, it just remained an incident. Does that make sense? Because it's still within the same world of governance and compliance. Had that person, however, that saw it, been outside, an outsider or an unknown individual, now we're into that probability or likelihood of misuse. Does this make sense? And now we have a breach. So you see how it kind of escalated. And it takes real analysis to move through this. And management can understand and appreciate this. And so we're not, as soon as we get this report back here, we don't start running around saying we have a security breach or a security incident. No, we don't. We don't know yet. We got to figure it out in an honest, objective way, but we don't know yet. And so therefore, we don't run around with our hairs on fire and start making notifications to the world because we don't even know what to notify, okay? All right. Whoop. All right, went through that. Okay, so I want to very quickly go through the various steps. I spent more time on that flow chart and covered a lot of this material, but I just want to hit. So these, I'm going to click through each of these boxes real fast. So to basically, under the security event, you need to have a requirement to report. They need to stop working on the system, and it needs to be easy to submit. A real-life organization, event reporting is part of their lifeblood. Okay, I've worked with clients that said, "Oh, we don't want to have a list of events." Yes, you do. You want that awareness out there, right? You want everybody looking, and so you need to make it understood and easy to do. Potential exposure. You've got to consider all these various things. Investigate, review, articulate, conduct forensics investigation, etc. Again, we talked about that as I went through the flow chart. Is there a reason to believe that PHI could have been exposed? If yes, we have the vulnerability. Okay, analyzing vulnerability boils down to, if yes, we have an incident. That means interview the systems, et cetera. So all of this, just quickly, is the analysis that needs to take place to decide whether you go to the next level. And that'll vary based on the technology and the technical incident itself. Okay, I'm just going to flip through these. And of course, the bottom line is, there's a definition of a breach. And if yes, we have a breach. Again, somebody saw it who shouldn't have, and there's a good chance that they're going to misuse it. Okay? Or probable misuse it. All right, so now what? And again, even though I waited till it was declared a breach, we need to have had, hopefully, an incident response team already in place, right? With potentially a lot of these senior people involved in it, from the CIO to the CEO, or maybe it's just a CTO, who knows? Subject matter experts, human resources, maybe somebody from the business unit, operations. Let's not forget the media people, in-house counsel, maybe outside counsel. And you can kind of get to where one of my lessons learned is, if you don't have this organized or at least thought through prior to trying to deal with an incident, a breach, you're in a lot of trouble, right? Because you won't know who to involve, who to talk to, who's going to do what. And then you need to brief, because all that information we just gathered during that process flow, they're going to have to be brought up to speed. And again, if you have these established definitions and you see how it escalates, that conversation is a lot easier to have. Does this make sense? Okay. All right, so in summary, this is what I was trying to work through with you. An event is either unknown what it is yet, so they all start out as events. If there's no exposure, it kind of stays there. If there is potential to exposure, we call it a vulnerability. Now we're moving up the scale. If it's an incident, there was exposure, but we don't think it's going to amount to any harm. And then, of course, if there is risk of harm or harm has occurred, then we have a breach. Okay? We got this? That's the thought process that I want you to kind of work with. So I promise to walk through one. How many of you have heard of Heartland payment systems? How many of you know they currently rank, I'll say that, they currently rank number 7 on the all-time number of records breached that we've been collecting. Anybody know how many individual credit card information was exposed in the Heartland breach in 2008, 2009? Any guess? 130 million. That's what they reported. Okay? Now, so here I want you to think through that flow chart with me as we go through this. Okay? Items are missing from Heartland's California offices on May 8th. And this is a this year issue. This is real. We just pulled it off the news on June 1st. Okay. What do we have at this point? Where is it on the scale? It's an event, right? I don't know anything. Yep. Among the items missing were TVs, LCD panels, and 11 password-protected computers. What do we have at this point? I think maybe we have a vulnerability because these devices, password-protected computers are in the hands of somebody. We don't know who, right? But at least we have a vulnerability in my thought process, because we still don't know, but I'm learning more. Heartland suspects that 4 of the computers contained personally identifiable information, Social Security numbers, and banking information. They further made a statement, "We have seen no evidence suggesting that the data has been accessed on the stolen computers." It wasn't just somebody in the office, rearranged them, or they were sent out, whatever. They were stolen computers, or they were used in any way and have no reason to believe anything's going to happen with it. You see the language? Familiar kind of language that we just went through, right? So my question is, anybody buying that? I mean, give me a break. How would they possibly know that? That they were stolen. By whom? For what? And the fact that the computers were only password protected, how long is that going to prevent me to get to what's on that computer? Well, it may prevent me from getting to it, but I know people in here it wouldn't prevent them at all. Okay? So what do you think we have at this point? What would you, as the manager of incident response for Heartland, what would you be calling this right now? It's more than an event. It's more than a vulnerability. It's teetering on incident/breach, right? I think a fair assessment is I think we have a breach here because I don't know, and I don't know who took it. Now, one way for this not to be a breach in this scenario is upon investigation, we found out that the computers went missing, but they were taken by another Heartland office, you know, without the knowledge of management, et cetera. Okay, so maybe we could have an incident, meaning people are looking at data that maybe ought not to, but they're within our system. They're not going to misuse it. That would be an incident. But the fact that they were stolen, most likely for malicious reasons, we have a breach. Do we agree? We have a breach. We got a breach. Okay. And I just answered that question. What would it make it an incident? Let's do a little backstory on Heartland. 2008, I think they reported it in 2009, 130 million US credit card and debit cards, number 7 all time. They were number 1 for many, many months, but other organizations have stacked up on top of that, pushing them down a little. Heartland sent a breach notification letter to 2,200 people as a result of this, saying that their information may have been affected by this burglary, and they're offering 1 year of credit monitoring from Kroll to those who have been affected by the incident. I'm sure you all get that, right? Those kind of letters. The office that had the theft was a former Ovation payroll location. One thing is scary in looking at this. Heartland, not only the payment cards, but they seem to now be acquiring payroll management companies. So there's even more personal information that they're dealing with, okay? And their excuse is that we hadn't totally integrated them into our security program. Well, they bought them back, in 2013. So they're taking their time to integrate them into the program, which was mandated on them by virtue of that big breach back in 2008. So not a lot's changed there, in my personal opinion. Let's look at this notification letter that they published. So Heartland, get this, Heartland was notified on the May 8th that your information may have been compromised. It almost sounds like somebody else told them. It's not like we discovered it was. It's like somebody told us. An incident occurred, including password-protected computers. It's almost like, the normal consumer doesn't understand that password-protected computers doesn't do much in terms of protecting their information, but they're alluding to that it does. One of these computers may have had your information. Don't you think they ought to know what was on the computer? We have seen no evidence suggesting that the data has been accessed. Remember, it happened on May 8th. This is, I think, June 1st they put this out. Or we have no reason to think anything's going to happen. Again, how do they make this statement? I don't get it. We have involved the state. Well, that kind of gives you some assurance that things are being done. I don't know. Heartland continues to monitor the situation carefully. What does their monitoring of their systems have anything to do with somebody using my Social Security number and getting a loan someplace? It's just false security. Here's a beautiful thing. We are providing this notice to you out of an abundance of caution because we care. I don't buy any of this. Do you guys buy any of this? This is, in my opinion, a fraudulent sense of security to the individual that might be breached.
This seems like it's a statement of limitation of liability exposed to the press, so that a couple will see it.
Yeah, every word in there says, it's not really my fault. It occurred not as a result of what I did or didn't do. I'm surprised they don't use advanced persistent threat in here, implying that there's nothing we could have possibly done about this.
Well, the irony would be, though, the people that stole it may say, don't fight those discounts. We may have more here than we thought.
Yeah, because it could have been a unsuspecting burglary, and all they wanted to do was sell at the flea market. You're right. So anyway, you get the point here. There are some bad actors that are in charge of your personal information. That's what I'm trying to communicate to you. And the point being, I think their incident response team did a lousy job here. And we can see through it, and I think eventually it's going to catch up to them. And we had conversations last night. In some cases, there are experiences where incident response teams are told or guided into what not to look at because we might have to notify. And that kind of thing you want to stay well away from. And I'm sorry for you if you're a part of that now, but at least try to get this identified. Okay, I have a 5-minute warning. Incident response cycle. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but trying to give you a sense. But of course, it's really an event response cycle now that we know the definitions. Okay, it kind of looks like this. Pre-event prep, identifying event reporting, containment and initial assessment, right? Analysis and risk assessment, eradicate whatever it is. You know, here's where you talk about getting rid of the malware or whatever it is that you found. Escalation, notification plan, recovery, lessons learned, and of course, log, trend, and improve, and repeat the process, right? Now, I have a slide for each one of these boxes, and I'm going to just touch upon them real quickly for you. If you have an interest in the details on those slides, you can see the presentation that I'm sure will be uploaded, okay? But for interest of time, I want to move through this. Okay, preparation training. Publish the policy, name a point person, establish an incident response team, right? All of this stuff we previously talked about. Get it done early, because when you're dealing with a breach, it's not the time to try to figure out how you're going to manage it, right? You're just going to fail. Event reporting. Policy to report. In other words, you sign this document, like a confidentiality agreement, that if you see something, you're going to report it. Get everybody working on your behalf and standardize it, et cetera. Immediate common steps, right? Appoint a leader to launch that risk of harm tree. You want to start walking through this process. Evaluate through analysis. And again, you can get this stuff off the website when we finish. Okay, eradication. This is a lot of the technical stuff. What do? We were talking last night about people don't even know they have malware. What do I do? Who do I report it to? What's my first step? In fact, when is your presentation, Caleb? 2 p.m. We'll go into a lot of this. Okay, escalation notification, talked a lot about that already. Notification letter. There is, according to regulation, this has to be Appendix B to Part 12 CFR 748. That's a kind of a NCUA appendix for credit unions. It kind of walks you through. Your notice should include X. Okay, and it's a good guidance for what the notification letter should include. Recovery, of course, we all know that is the goal to restore the system as soon as possible. Prevent future events, talking about root cause, corrective action. I'm going through this fast, but this can take a while and take some real study. And then let's log it, learn from it, understand the trends, try to put in some preventative action, and not just be reactionary. Okay, so that was a quick view of the response cycle. I'm going to close real quickly with some lessons learned. Okay, know the laws that are associated with whatever PII you might have, of the residents or your clients, et cetera. Know what you are required to do. Okay, publish an incident response policy, which is your common terms. Let's get on the same page. You don't have to use the ones that I suggest here, but use what makes sense for you guys. Responsibility to report, the risk of harm tree, central coordination, and gather a list of the authorities and external experts that you think you might need ahead of time. Okay? And then have a communication plan, meaning what could be communicated, when, by whom, and to whom, right? That's one of the problems you get into is that people are real quick to run off and tell people they ought not be telling, and you need to kind of centralize that. Like, who talks to media? Chances are it's none of us. It's somebody who knows how to do that in order to control the damage, even in a legitimate fashion. Last ones, media relations, talked about that. Conduct employee management awareness training. Everybody needs to be aware of what and how we want to approach this. Prearrange those relationships. Seriously consider buying some insurance to help you survive a catastrophic breach. Conduct exercises. The value of even just doing a tabletop exercise, just sitting there and saying, the CBS News found this data backup tape in the dumpster, and it has your name on it. What do we do? How do we act? And then you can create little simulation on that and get the right people to respond. Okay? And so the last lesson and the most important one is expect a data breach, document and practice how you're going to respond, and then be able to figure out just what it is that's knocking you on the head, an event, a vulnerability, an incident, or a breach. And that concludes my remarks. I thank you for your patience and listening. I think the only thing following me is lunch, right? So if anyone has any questions, please let me know. You can come up. I'll be around.